The Productivity Shift. Unlocking Productivity, the Silent Superpower. Written and published by Rising Audiobook. Introduction. You are not bad at productivity. You are not broken, lazy or lacking discipline. You are simply operating inside a system that was never designed to protect your attention. It was designed to drain it. Every notification that interrupts your focus, every quick switch between tasks, every just 1-minute distraction is silently stealing your future output, not in a dramatic way, but in small, invisible fragments that accumulate into lost hours, lost momentum, and ultimately, lost potential. The real enemy has never been time. You do not lack time. You live in the same 24 hours as everyone else. The real enemy is fragmentation of attention, the constant breaking of your mind into smaller pieces until deep thinking becomes rare and shallow reacting becomes normal. That is why most people are working harder than ever, yet achieving less than ever, and they cannot explain why. But what if productivity was never about effort? What if it was never about doing more, but about controlling what gets your attention, your energy, and your intention? If you stay till the end, you will understand the silent superpower behind real productivity. And if this resonates with you, subscribe, because what you are about to learn may permanently change how you work, think, and live. Let's begin. Chapter 1. The Wake-Up Moment. Why your productivity is collapsing. There is a moment most people never clearly notice. It doesn't arrive with alarms or dramatic failure. It arrives quietly, subtly, like a system running in the background that slowly stops responding the way it used to. One day, you realize you are working more than before, but finishing less. You are staying busy longer, but feeling more behind. You are pushing harder, but somehow the ground keeps slipping under your progress. And because it happens gradually, you assume it is normal. You adjust, you compensate, you add more effort where structure has already started to break. This is how productivity collapses, not suddenly, but through slow system decay. Most people misunderstand this stage completely. They assume they are becoming less disciplined, less focused, less capable. So they respond the only way they know how: more pressure, more hours, more self-criticism. But the truth is far less personal. You are not failing to work. Your workflow is failing you, and that distinction changes everything. Because when you believe the problem is you attack yourself. But when you see the problem as a system failure, you begin to observe patterns instead of emotions. You stop asking, "What is wrong with me?" and start asking, "Where is the breakdown happening?" Look closely, and you will see it is never one big collapse. It is dozens of small inefficiencies stacking over time. A morning that starts without clarity, a task list that expands but never contracts, a focus session interrupted so often it never fully forms, a habit of switching between inputs instead of completing outputs. None of these feel catastrophic in isolation, but together they quietly dismantle your ability to produce meaningful work. And in the middle of this breakdown, something even more deceptive happens. You begin to confuse exhaustion with progress. You feel tired at the end of the day, so you assume you must have worked hard. You feel mentally drained, so you assume you must have been productive. But exhaustion is not proof of effectiveness. It is only proof of energy spent, and energy can be spent in any direction, useful or wasted. Many people are not overworking their priorities. They are under-executing them while overloading their attention. Constant switching creates the illusion of effort without the reality of output. You feel active all day, but very little actually moves forward. And because the brain associates movement with progress, it rarely questions the outcome. This is where the system quietly turns against you. The more fragmented your attention becomes, the more effort you require just to maintain basic output. Simple tasks feel heavier. Decisions feel slower. Starting becomes harder than finishing, and instead of identifying the pattern, you interpret it as personal decline. But this is not decline. It is overload without structure. At this stage, most people increase effort again, thinking discipline is the missing piece. They wake up earlier, push harder, try new tools, new routines, new strategies, but nothing stabilizes because effort cannot fix a broken system. It can only temporarily mask its flaws. And so the cycle continues until a moment arrives, often quiet, often unplanned, where you finally see it. You are not lazy. You are not incapable. You are operating inside a system that leaks attention, fragments focus, and converts energy into motion instead of meaningful output. And once you see that clearly, something shifts. Not immediately in your results, but in your awareness. Because awareness is the beginning of control. This is the true wake-up moment. Not when everything falls apart, but when you finally realize it has been breaking slowly all along and that it can be rebuilt. Chapter 2. The Distraction Economy. Why you can't focus anymore. There was a time when focus failed because of lack of discipline. Today, focus fails because it is constantly under attack. You are not imagining it. Your attention really is harder to hold than it used to be. But the reason is not personal weakness, it is design. You are living inside an economy that no longer trades in just money or products. It trades in something far more valuable, your attention. Every platform you open is competing for the same resource, your awareness. And unlike money, attention is limited in a far more absolute way. You cannot spend it in two places at once. You cannot recover it once it is fragmented, and you cannot fully control it unless you learn how it is being taken from you. This is the distraction economy. In this system, your focus is not protected. It is targeted. Every app on your device is engineered with one core objective: to interrupt your deepest thought at the exact moment it begins to form, not when you are idle, not when you are finished, but precisely when you start to enter depth. Because depth is dangerous to this system. Depth means less scrolling, less switching, less engagement, and engagement is what the system survives on. So notifications are not random, they are timed interruptions. Feeds are not neutral lists of content. They are carefully structured environments designed to keep your mind slightly unsettled, always looking for the next input. Even the design of colors, sounds, and motion is optimized to pull you out of silence before silence becomes awareness. And slowly, without noticing it, your brain adapts. Focus is no longer natural. It becomes something you must defend. This is the shift most people never recognize. They assume they are simply getting distracted more easily, but what is actually happening is conditioning. The modern environment trains your nervous system to expect interruption. It rewards switching, it rewards novelty, it rewards the next thing more than the current thing. And over time, your mind begins to prefer it. A task that requires sustained attention starts to feel uncomfortable. A moment of silence feels like something is missing. A single goal feels too narrow. So you unconsciously open another tab, another app, another stream of input, not because you need it, but because your brain has been trained to seek stimulation instead of depth. This is how attention becomes fragmented at scale. You sit down to work, fully intending to focus, but within minutes something interrupts the thread. A message appears, a thought pops up, a notification flashes, and even if you resist it, a part of your attention has already shifted. The original thought is gone, replaced by a dozen smaller ones competing for space. And then something familiar happens. You open your phone to check one message and end up scrolling for 40 minutes without remembering why you picked it up in the first place. This is not a failure of discipline. It is a system that is engineered to dissolve intention. Because intention is fragile in the presence of constant interruption. Every time your focus is broken, your brain pays a switching cost. It takes time to rebuild depth, and most people never stay in one place long enough to fully rebuild it. So instead they live in fragments. Fragments of work, fragments of thought, fragments of progress. The result is a strange illusion, constant activity without sustained output. You feel busy, but nothing deep gets completed. You feel engaged, but nothing meaningful accumulates. You feel connected, but your attention is scattered across too many directions to create anything lasting. And this is where the real danger of the distraction economy becomes clear. It does not just steal your time, it trains your mind. It rewires your expectations of how thinking should feel. It replaces depth with speed, patience with stimulation, and clarity with noise. And once that shift happens, silence itself feels uncomfortable. You begin to reach for distraction, not because you lack control, but because stillness feels unfamiliar. This is why modern focus feels so fragile. It is not that you cannot focus. It is that your environment has taught you not to. But recognition changes everything, because once you see the system clearly, you are no longer reacting blindly to it. You begin to notice the patterns. You see how quickly attention is pulled. You recognize when a simple task is being stretched into multiple interruptions. You understand that every small distraction is not isolated, it is part of a larger structure designed to fragment your thinking. And in that awareness, something important begins to form. A gap between stimulus and response, a space where control becomes possible again. Focus is no longer something you hope for, it becomes something you actively defend. Chapter 3. The Silent Superpower Explained. Most people misunderstand productivity because they keep measuring the wrong thing. They look at output, hours worked, tasks completed, boxes checked. They assume productivity is a visible result, something that can be counted at the end of the day. But what they don't see is everything that happened before the result ever existed. Because productivity is not output. Output is just the final symptom. Productivity is control of mental direction, and that changes the entire definition of performance. Before anything is created, solved, or completed, there is always a moment of direction, a decision about where attention goes, what gets priority, what thought is allowed to continue, and what gets interrupted. That invisible layer before action is where productivity is actually born or lost. Most people never operate at that level consciously. They react instead of directing. They respond to whatever appears in front of them, a message, a task, a notification, a sudden thought. And each time they respond, they are not choosing their work, they are surrendering their direction. Over time, this creates a life that feels busy but unfocused, active but scattered, moving but not necessarily advancing. This is why effort alone cannot explain success, because effort without direction is just energy dispersion. The real difference between high performers and everyone else is not intelligence or even skill. It is control over attention, energy, and intention, the three forces that silently determine every outcome before any visible action takes place. Attention decides what enters your mind. Energy determines how deeply you can engage with it. Intention decides why you are doing it in the first place. When these three are aligned, productivity feels almost effortless, not because the work is easy, but because nothing is leaking. No mental fragmentation, no internal contradiction, no constant switching between competing priorities. Everything is pointed in one direction. But when they are misaligned, even simple tasks feel heavy. Attention keeps drifting. Energy gets wasted on switching. Intention becomes unclear, so motivation collapses. And the result is confusion disguised as effort. This is the hidden structure most people never learn to see. Those who control focus control outcomes. Not because focus itself is magical, but because focus determines continuity. And continuity is what allows anything meaningful to be built. Every important result in life, skills, careers, businesses, transformations, requires sustained attention over time. Without it, nothing compounds, nothing deepens, nothing stabilizes. Yet modern life continuously pulls against this principle. It rewards interruption, it rewards reaction, it rewards switching. So most people unconsciously train themselves into a fragmented state of thinking, where attention is constantly redirected before it has time to develop depth. And they call this normal. But it is not normal. It is unstable. This is why two people with identical skills can produce completely different results. On paper, they look the same intelligence, same experience, same tools, but one of them protects their focus like it is the most valuable asset they own. The other allows it to be fragmented throughout the day by constant interruptions, small distractions, and unstructured attention shifts. At the end of a week, the difference is visible. At the end of a month, it is undeniable. At the end of a year, it becomes a completely different life trajectory, and the only difference was control. Control over what they allowed into their attention, control over how long they stayed with a task, control over whether energy was preserved or scattered, control over whether intention stayed clear or became diluted by constant switching. This is why productivity is called a silent superpower, because it does not announce itself. It does not feel dramatic in the moment. There is no single visible action that reveals it. It is not one habit or one technique. It is a hidden layer of discipline operating underneath everything else, guiding behavior before behavior becomes visible. And most importantly, it is invisible to others, but fully experienced in your results. You do not see someone's attention management when you look at their success. You see only the outcome. But behind that outcome is a pattern of invisible decisions repeated thousands of times, to stay focused or to switch, to continue or to interrupt, to deepen or to drift. The silent superpower is not doing more. It is deciding what deserves your mind and refusing to give it away cheaply. Once this is understood, productivity stops being a struggle against time. It becomes a practice of direction, and the moment you begin to control direction, you begin to control outcomes at the root level, long before they ever appear in your life. Chapter 4. The Time Leak Audit. Where your life is actually going. Most people believe they understand their time. They think they know where their hours go, what they spend energy on, and why the day never feels long enough. But this belief is usually an illusion, because time loss is rarely obvious. It does not announce itself. It does not leave clear evidence. It disappears in fragments so small that they feel insignificant in the moment. This is what makes it dangerous. You do not feel time leaking. You only feel the result of it: unfinished tasks, delayed goals, and the quiet frustration of knowing you worked all day but moved very little forward. And because there is no single visible failure, you assume the problem must be lack of time. But it is not. It is invisible leakage, a slow, continuous drain of attention and energy that never feels large enough to question, but becomes massive when accumulated across days, weeks, and months. This is why productivity collapse feels confusing. You do not remember wasting hours. You remember moments, a few minutes here, a short distraction there, a quick check of something, a brief switch in focus. Each one feels harmless. Each one feels justified, but together they form a hidden structure of loss. Small distractions compound into massive weekly inefficiency, not because each distraction is destructive on its own, but because they interrupt continuity, and continuity is what creates real progress. Every time your focus breaks, you do not just lose time, you lose momentum, and rebuilding momentum costs far more than the interruption itself. This is where most people misunderstand their own behavior. They evaluate their productivity based on intention rather than reality. They believe, "I intended to work today," so they assume they worked effectively. But intention is not execution. Planning is not output. Thinking about work is not work. And this is why most schedules fail silently. On paper, the day looks structured. Tasks are listed. Goals are defined, time blocks are assigned, but real behavior rarely follows this structure. Instead, the day becomes a mixture of reactive responses, unplanned interruptions, and fragmented focus sessions that never fully stabilize. Most schedules reflect intention poorly. They show what you wanted to do, not what actually happened. And that gap is where your life quietly slips away. Because time is not only spent in large blocks of productivity or leisure, It is also spent in transitions, in hesitation, in switching, in opening and closing tasks without completion, in starting something, getting interrupted, returning later, losing context, and starting again. These micro-events do not feel like time consumption, but they are the hidden majority of modern working life. This is why simply planning better does not fix productivity. You must audit behavior, not just design schedules. A time leak audit is not about asking, "What should I do tomorrow?" It is about asking, "What actually happened today?" And more importantly, where did my attention go when I thought I was working? Because once you begin observing behavior instead of assuming it, patterns emerge quickly. You begin to notice how often you switch tasks without finishing them, how frequently you check unrelated information under the illusion of necessity, how many times you interrupt deep work with quick distractions that reset your mental state, and most importantly, how rarely you stay in uninterrupted focus long enough for meaningful output to form. This is where awareness becomes uncomfortable but powerful, because most people believe they don't have time, when in reality they are spending hours every day in low-value attention cycles, not resting, not working deeply, but constantly switching between small inputs that feel productive because they keep the mind active. For example, a person may genuinely believe they are overwhelmed with responsibilities and lack time for important goals, yet when their actual behavior is observed, they may find that more than 3 hours per day are spent on non-essential scrolling, reactive messaging, and fragmented task switching, not because they chose to waste time, but because no system was protecting it. And that is the key difference. Time leakage is not intentional, it is structural. It happens in the absence of awareness and boundaries. It happens when attention is unprotected and constantly available for interruption. It happens when every moment of stillness is filled instantly, rather than used intentionally. This is why auditing behavior is more important than planning time. Planning assumes control. Auditing reveals reality, and without reality, improvement becomes guesswork. Once you begin to see your time clearly, not as you imagine it, but as it actually unfolds, you stop trusting assumptions about productivity. You start working with evidence. And that evidence almost always reveals the same truth. You are not short on time, you are short on uninterrupted attention. The moment this becomes visible, everything shifts, because you can no longer ignore what you now see. And once you can see the leaks, you can begin to close them. Chapter 5. The Dopamine Trap. Why you choose easy over important. There is a quiet force behind most of your daily decisions, and you rarely notice it working. It does not feel like pressure. It does not feel like control. In fact, it often feels like preference, like you are simply choosing what you want. But underneath that sense of choice is a deeper mechanism shaping your behavior in real time. Your brain is not designed to optimize your future. It is designed to optimize your reward. And reward, in its most immediate form, is dopamine. This is why the easiest path often feels like the most attractive path, even when you know it is not the most important one. The brain naturally prioritizes instant feedback over delayed value. It prefers what feels good now over what matters later. Not because you are weak, but because your nervous system evolved in an environment where immediate reward was survival-based. But you are no longer living in that environment. You are living in a system that constantly overstimulates that reward mechanism. Every digital platform, every feed, every short-form content loop is engineered to deliver rapid dopamine cycles, quick novelty, instant engagement, constant switching. Each interaction gives a small reward signal that tells your brain, this is worth repeating. And slowly, without realizing it, your decision-making starts to reorganize around this system. Hard tasks begin to feel heavier, not because they are harder in reality, but because they do not provide immediate emotional payoff. There is no instant reward for writing, studying, building, or thinking deeply. The reward is delayed, sometimes significantly, and in the absence of immediate feedback, the brain interprets the task as less valuable in the moment. So when you sit down to do important work, you are not only facing the task itself, you are also competing against a system that promises faster, easier rewards just one tap away. And that competition is uneven, because one side requires patience, focus, and sustained discomfort. The other side offers instant stimulation with zero effort. This is where the dopamine trap forms. It is not a single decision. It is a repeated pattern of choosing what is easy over what is meaningful, reinforced hundreds of times until it becomes automatic. You reach for the phone before the thought even completes. You switch tasks before the discomfort of focus settles in. You delay deep work because something lighter feels more accessible in the moment. And each time you do, the brain learns the same lesson. Instant reward wins. Over time, discipline does not disappear. It weakens in influence. Not because you lack willpower, but because dopamine begins to dominate decision priority. The brain starts assigning higher importance to stimuli that deliver quick feedback and lower importance to tasks that require sustained attention. This is not a conscious choice. It is a rewiring of preference through repetition. This is why even highly ambitious people struggle with consistency. They do not lack goals. They do not lack intelligence. They do not lack awareness. They simply exist in a reward environment that constantly pulls them away from delayed value actions and toward immediate gratification loops. And the more they give in, the stronger the loop becomes. This is where the real conflict begins, not between you and your goals, but between your future self and your present reward system. Because every time you choose the easy option, you are not just avoiding discomfort. You are reinforcing a neural pattern that makes the next important decision even harder to choose. And every time you choose the difficult path, even briefly, you are strengthening the ability to tolerate delay, discomfort, and focus. This is why productivity is not only about systems or schedules. It is also about neurological direction. You are training what your brain considers valuable, and most modern environments are training it in the opposite direction of long-term success. A simple example makes this clear. You sit down intending to study something important. It requires focus, patience, and mental effort. But within seconds, your attention drifts to your phone. A short video appears. It is easier. It is faster. It gives immediate stimulation. You watch one, then another, and suddenly 40 minutes disappear without any memory of choosing to spend that time. Not because you made a conscious decision to waste time, but because your brain selected the path with the fastest reward loop. This is the dopamine trap in action. It does not force you. It persuades you, quietly, repeatedly, until ease feels more natural than effort and distraction feels more normal than depth. But once you understand this mechanism, something important changes. You stop interpreting these choices as moral failures. You stop labeling yourself as undisciplined. And instead, you begin to see the structure behind the behavior. Because what is understood can be redirected. The goal is not to eliminate dopamine. That is impossible. The goal is to reclaim control over where it is earned, to shift reward from passive consumption to active creation, from instant stimulation to meaningful progress. And that shift is where real productivity begins to take shape. Chapter 6. The Focus Rebuild Protocol. At some point, focus stops feeling natural. You sit down with intention, ready to work, and yet something feels off. The mind doesn't settle the way it used to. Thoughts drift faster. Urges to check something appear sooner. Even when you resist, there is a quiet instability underneath your attention, as if your mind is no longer used to staying in one place for long. This is not a permanent condition. It is a trained response, and anything that is trained can be rebuilt. Focus is not a fixed trait that some people have and others do not. It is a skill, one that strengthens or weakens depending on how it is used. And in a world designed around interruption, most people have unintentionally trained their focus to fragment. The good news is that the same mechanism that weakened it can also restore it. But restoration does not happen through motivation. It happens through structure. The Focus Rebuild protocol begins with a simple but uncomfortable truth. Attention must be retrained through resistance, not comfort. You cannot rebuild deep focus in an environment that continuously rewards switching. You cannot strengthen attention while constantly feeding it distraction. Just like a muscle, focus grows only when it is held under controlled strain long enough to adapt. That means the first stage of rebuilding focus is not learning more techniques, it is removing friction from depth and increasing friction for distraction. Because right now, your environment is likely doing the opposite. Every device within reach, every notification system, every easy escape route is designed to interrupt the exact moment your mind begins to settle. So even when you attempt to focus, your environment silently works against you. And over time, your brain learns to expect interruption before depth can even begin. To rebuild focus, this pattern must be reversed. Deep work does not start with effort. It starts with environment control. Before you attempt to concentrate, you must decide what your environment is allowed to do to you. Not in theory, but in structure. If distraction is physically or digitally available, your brain will eventually use it. Not because you lack discipline, but because accessibility lowers resistance. And low resistance always wins in the short term. So the protocol begins by creating boundaries that protect attention before you even begin working, not as a motivational choice, but as a structural decision. A controlled space where the mind has no easy escape routes and therefore no choice but to settle. But environment alone is not enough. The next stage is repetition of single tasking. This is where most people struggle because the modern mind has been trained to associate productivity with switching. Multiple tabs, multiple tasks, multiple inputs all feel like progress. But in reality, they are just fragmented attention patterns disguised as activity. Single tasking feels unnatural at first because it removes stimulation. There is no constant novelty, no immediate reward shifts, just one task, sustained over time. And initially, this feels uncomfortable. The mind resists. It searches for escape. It tries to negotiate with you. But if you stay with it long enough, something begins to change. The mind adapts. The scattered energy starts to settle. Thoughts slow down. Resistance reduces. And attention begins to stabilize into something deeper than surface-level focus. This is where real cognitive strength begins to return, not through intensity, but through continuity, and each repetition strengthens the system. Focus is rebuilt the same way it was lost, through repeated behavior. Every uninterrupted session reinforces the ability to stay. Every resisted distraction weakens the pull of fragmentation. Every return to a single task rebuilds the neural tolerance for depth. This is why focus cannot be restored in one day, but it can be restored predictably, because it is not emotional, it is structural. There will be moments when the old pattern returns, when switching feels easier, when distraction feels closer than effort. But those moments are not failures. They are tests of whether the structure is strong enough to hold attention longer than impulse. And over time, as repetition accumulates, something subtle but powerful happens. You no longer need to fight as hard to stay focused. The mind begins to enter depth more quickly. The urge to switch reduces. The discomfort of staying decreases. And what once required force begins to feel natural again. This is the rebuild. Not a sudden transformation, but a gradual stabilization of attention. And once focus becomes stable again, everything else in productivity becomes easier, because nothing meaningful in performance happens without the ability to stay with one thing long enough for it to matter. Chapter 7. The Identity Shift of High Performers. There comes a point in productivity where effort stops being the driving force. At first, most people rely on motivation. They wait for the right mood, the right energy, the right circumstances. They try to push themselves into action through discipline, reminders, and pressure. And for a while, this works in short bursts, but it never holds for long, because motivation is unstable by nature. It rises and falls depending on emotion, environment, and energy levels, and anything built on instability will eventually collapse under pressure. High performers eventually learn this truth, not intellectually, but through repetition and failure. They realize that the real difference between inconsistency and sustained performance is not effort, it is identity. This is where the shift begins. Instead of asking, "How do I make myself do this?" they begin asking a different question entirely. Who am I when I do this consistently? Because identity is not what you think about yourself in moments of clarity. Identity is what you default to under pressure, under fatigue, and under distraction. It is the internal assumption your brain uses to decide behavior without negotiation. And once identity is established, behavior follows without constant resistance. This is why two people can face the same task and respond completely differently. One says, "I should really get this done," but still hesitates, delays, and negotiates with themselves. The other does not enter negotiation at all. The action is assumed, not because it is easier, but because it aligns with self-perception. "I am productive" creates a completely different internal system than "I want to be productive." One is identity-based, the other is desire-based, and desire always requires effort to maintain. Identity does not. When someone identifies as a productive person, their brain begins to filter decisions through that assumption. Small choices become easier, starting becomes less debated, finishing becomes more automatic, not because the tasks changed, but because the decision-making layer has been removed. There is no longer a question of whether they will act. There is only the question of how they will act. This is where consistency becomes stable, because consistency is not built in moments of high energy. It is built in moments of low energy, when identity takes over decision-making, when there is no motivation, no inspiration, no external push, and yet action still happens. That is the real test of identity. Anyone can act when they feel like it, but high performers act even when they do not through force, but through alignment. Their behavior is not constantly created, it is continuously expressed from who they believe they are, and over time, repetition reinforces that belief. Every time you act in alignment with a productive identity, you strengthen that identity. Every time you break that alignment, you weaken it. The brain does not separate action from self-perception, it merges them, which means behavior is not just something you do, it is something you become through repetition. This is why change feels difficult at first, but easier later. Not because tasks become simpler, but because identity begins to stabilize. At the beginning, you must consciously choose behavior. You must override resistance. You must remind yourself who you are trying to be. But gradually, those reminders become unnecessary. The behavior becomes expected. The identity becomes automatic. And once that happens, consistency is no longer an achievement. It is a baseline. This is the hidden advantage of high performers. They are not constantly convincing themselves to act. They have already decided, at an identity level, what kind of person they are, and everything they do flows from that decision. So the real shift is not in productivity techniques, it is in self-definition. Because once you stop asking, "What should I do?" and start operating from "This is who I am," the entire structure of effort changes, and productivity stops being something you chase and becomes something you express. Chapter 8. The Energy-Time Equation. Most people organize their life around time. They measure productivity in hours, schedules, and deadlines. They believe that more time automatically means more output, and that efficiency is simply a matter of better planning within those hours. But this assumption hides a deeper truth, one that quietly explains why some people achieve more in less time while others struggle despite long workdays. Time is not the real currency of productivity, energy is. You can have all the time in the world, But if your energy is depleted, your output collapses into low-quality effort, slow execution, and mental resistance. Time becomes a container, but energy determines what fills it. Without energy, even the most structured schedule becomes ineffective. This is why many people feel exhausted but unproductive. They assume they have worked enough because the hours passed. But passing time is not the same as producing value. You can sit at a desk for 8 hours and still create very little meaningful output if your internal state is fragmented, tired, or mentally drained. Energy is what transforms time into results. And energy is not just physical. It is mental, emotional, and cognitive. It is the clarity you bring into a task. It is the stability of your attention. It is the absence of internal resistance when you begin work. When energy is high, decisions become faster, focus becomes deeper, and execution becomes more fluid. When energy is low, everything feels heavier than it should. This is why two people can work the same 8-hour day and produce completely different outcomes. One enters the day with focus, clarity, and sustained internal drive. Their attention is stable, their thoughts are organized, and their execution is continuous. They move through tasks without constant friction. The other enters the same day mentally scattered, already fatigued, and easily distracted. Every task requires effort to start. Every interruption resets their momentum. At the end of the day, one person has completed work that moves their life forward. The other feels busy but unfulfilled. Not because they lacked time, but because they lacked usable energy. This is the energy-time equation in action. Time sets the boundary of your day, but energy determines the quality of what happens inside it. And unlike time, energy fluctuates. It can be managed, protected, or depleted, depending on how you structure your habits, attention, and recovery. Most people unknowingly sabotage their energy before they even begin meaningful work. They start the day with scattered attention, reactive thinking, and unnecessary consumption of information. By the time they attempt deep work, their mental clarity is already reduced. They try to compensate with effort, but effort without energy leads to burnout, not progress. This is why managing energy multiplies output without increasing hours. When your energy is high, the same task requires less resistance. You start faster, you stay longer, you think more clearly, you recover more quickly after interruptions, and most importantly, you produce work that actually moves forward instead of just filling time. Energy determines execution speed, not in the sense of rushing, but in the sense of flow. High energy does not feel chaotic, it feels aligned. Actions connect smoothly, thoughts stay organized. Decisions require less internal debate. There is less friction between intention and action. Low energy does the opposite. It creates delay, hesitation, and constant negotiation with yourself. Even simple tasks feel heavy because the internal system is not supporting execution. This is why productivity cannot be separated from physical and mental states. Sleep quality, stress levels, emotional load, and cognitive overload all contribute to how much usable energy you have in a given day. Ignoring these factors while trying to improve productivity is like trying to increase speed without considering fuel. And yet most people focus only on time management. They try to squeeze more tasks into the same hours instead of increasing the quality of energy available during those hours. They optimize calendars while ignoring internal states. They build schedules that assume consistent performance even when their energy is inconsistent. But real productivity is not about filling time, it is about maximizing energy within time. Once you understand this, your approach shifts. You begin to see that protecting energy is just as important as protecting time. You become more selective about what drains you, what restores you, and what fragments your attention. Because every action either contributes to or subtracts from your ability to perform later. And over time, this awareness changes everything. You stop asking how many hours you worked and start asking how much meaningful output you produced. You stop measuring busyness and start measuring clarity. And you realize that the real leverage in productivity was never about adding more time to your day, but about bringing more energy into the time you already have. Chapter 9. The Habit Architecture of Productivity. At a certain level of performance, motivation stops being useful. Not because it disappears completely, but because it becomes unreliable as a foundation. Some days it is strong, other days it is absent. And when your entire system depends on how you feel, consistency becomes fragile, progress becomes uneven, and execution becomes something you have to negotiate with yourself every single time. High performers eventually stop relying on motivation altogether. They shift towards something more stable, more predictable, and far less emotionally dependent systems built on habits. Because habits are not about effort in the moment, they are about removing effort from the moment entirely. A habit is a decision that has already been made so many times that it no longer requires conscious negotiation. It is automation of behavior through repetition. And when enough of your important actions become habitual, productivity stops being something you chase and starts becoming something that simply happens. This is the architecture behind sustained performance. Habits reduce decision fatigue. Every decision you make throughout the day carries a cognitive cost. What to do next, when to start, how to begin, whether to continue, whether to stop. When these decisions accumulate, mental energy drains faster than most people realize. And by the time they reach important tasks, they are already operating at reduced capacity. But habits remove this burden. When behavior is automated, the mind no longer wastes energy deciding whether to act. It simply follows the established pattern. There is no internal debate, no delay, no resistance. The action begins without negotiation, because the decision has already been made in advance. This is why systems outperform motivation in long-term consistency. Motivation depends on emotional states. Systems depend on structure, and structure does not fluctuate based on mood. It remains stable even when energy is low or focus is inconsistent. It acts as a framework that holds behavior in place when internal drive is weak. Most people try to improve productivity by increasing motivation. High performers improve it by increasing structure. They design systems that make the right actions easier than the wrong ones. They do not rely on discipline in the moment. They rely on design before the moment. And over time, this design shapes behavior automatically. This is where the real transformation begins. When structure is strong enough, willpower becomes less necessary. And when willpower is no longer the primary driver of action, consistency becomes sustainable instead of exhausting. Because willpower is a limited resource, it drains throughout the day. It weakens under stress. It becomes unreliable when fatigue sets in. But systems do not depend on internal energy. They depend on external design. And this is why environment-linked habits are so powerful. Your environment quietly determines a large portion of your behavior without asking for permission. Where you sit, what you see, what is within reach. All of these elements influence what you do next. If your environment makes distraction easier than focus, distraction will dominate. If it makes focus easier than distraction, focus will dominate. This is not a matter of discipline, it is a matter of accessibility. A well-designed environment reduces friction for productive behavior and increases friction for unproductive behavior. Over time, this shapes habits naturally. You begin to associate certain spaces with certain actions. The mind no longer needs instruction, it responds to context. Sit in one place, and you automatically begin deep work. Enter another space, and your mind shifts into rest or recovery mode. Open a specific setup, and focus begins without resistance. This is how environment becomes part of the habit loop. Cue, action, reward. But in this case, the cue is external structure, not internal willpower. Once habits are anchored into environment and repetition, they begin to operate independently of emotional state. You no longer need to feel motivated to start. You no longer need to wait for clarity to begin. The system carries you into action automatically, and this is where productivity becomes stable, because stability does not come from intensity. It comes from repetition without resistance, the same actions repeated under the same conditions until they no longer require conscious effort. At this stage, productivity is no longer something you actively manage moment by moment. It becomes something embedded into how you live. You do not ask whether you will work. You simply enter the system that produces work. You do not debate whether to start. You follow the structure that already defines starting. And slowly, the architecture of your habits begins to shape the trajectory of your outcomes, because what you repeat, you become. Chapter 10. The Deep Work Threshold. There is a moment in every attempt at deep work that most people misunderstand. It does not feel productive. It does not feel smooth. It does not feel like flow. In fact, it often feels like the opposite. Mental resistance, scattered thinking, slow entry, and a strange sense that your mind is refusing to cooperate. And this is exactly where most people quit. Not because they cannot do deep work, but because they never stay long enough to reach it. Deep work does not begin at the start of focus. It begins after resistance is overcome. At the beginning of any meaningful task, your mind is not aligned with depth. It is still carrying fragments from previous attention shifts, unfinished thoughts, lingering distractions, emotional residue from earlier interruptions. So when you try to focus, you are not starting from clarity. You are starting from noise. This is why the first stage of concentration always feels unstable. You read the same line twice. You lose track of your thoughts. You feel the urge to check something else. You question whether you are in the right state to begin at all. And because this feels unproductive, you assume something is wrong. But nothing is wrong. You are simply at the entry phase of depth. Most people misinterpret this phase as failure. They believe focus should feel immediate, smooth, and effortless from the start. So when it does not, they switch tasks, open distractions, or postpone the work entirely. And in doing so, they reset the entire process before depth has a chance to form. Because deep work has a threshold, a transition point where scattered attention begins to stabilize into sustained focus. And this threshold is rarely reached because most people stop just before it. The mind needs time to settle. Just like water takes time to become still after being disturbed, attention takes time to stabilize after fragmentation. At first, everything is in motion, thoughts rise and fall unpredictably. But if you remain in place long enough, without switching, without interrupting, without escaping, the movement begins to slow, and something changes. The resistance starts to fade. Not instantly, but gradually. The need to check something weakens. The urge to switch loses intensity. Thoughts become more linear, less fragmented, and the task that felt heavy just minutes earlier begins to feel more natural, more contained, more accessible. This is the threshold being crossed. And once it is crossed, the quality of output changes completely. Entry friction determines productivity quality. If your environment and habits make it easy to start and stay, you reach the threshold more often. If your environment is full of friction, interruptions, and easy escape routes, you rarely reach it at all. This is why some people experience deep work regularly, while others only experience fragments of it. The difference is not ability, it is entry design. But even with perfect conditions, there is always an initial resistance phase. The mind does not immediately commit to depth. It tests you. It offers alternatives. It tries to pull you back into easier, more familiar patterns of thinking. And if you give in too early, you never experience what comes after, because after resistance comes stability, and after stability comes acceleration. Once deep work fully activates, something unexpected happens. Effort does not increase, it decreases. Not because the task becomes easier, but because mental fragmentation disappears. You are no longer fighting your own attention. You are no longer restarting your focus every few seconds. You are no longer negotiating with distraction. The mind locks in. Thoughts connect more fluidly. Ideas build on each other without interruption. Time perception begins to shift. What felt like long effort suddenly becomes compressed into uninterrupted flow, and in this state, output quality increases exponentially, not linearly. This is why extended focus produces disproportionate results. 1 hour of true deep work is not equal to 1 hour of fragmented effort. It is often equal to several hours of interrupted productivity because there is no loss in transitions, no mental resetting, and no cognitive re-entry cost. But most people never experience this consistently. Not because they lack capability, but because they never stay long enough in the initial discomfort to reach the threshold where focus stabilizes. They evaluate too early. They judge productivity in the first 10 or 15 minutes, exactly when the mind is still unstable. And because it does not feel effective yet, they assume it will not become effective at all. But deep work is not immediate. It is emergent. It reveals itself only after resistance is endured long enough for structure to form. And once you recognize this pattern, your relationship with focus begins to change. You stop expecting instant clarity. You stop reacting to early discomfort. You stop abandoning sessions before they mature. Instead, you learn to stay. And in staying, you begin to access a state of work that most people never consistently reach, not because it is rare, but because it lies just beyond the point where most people give up. Chapter 11. The Discipline Loop. Discipline is often misunderstood as something dramatic. People imagine it as a burst of force, a moment of extreme willpower, a decision made under pressure that changes everything overnight. But real discipline does not behave like that. It does not appear in sudden explosions of effort. It does not depend on emotional intensity. It does not require inspiration. In reality, discipline is far quieter. It is built through repetition, not intensity. This is the first truth most people miss. They try to change their life through big commitments, long study sessions, extreme routines, aggressive schedules. But intensity burns out quickly when it is not supported by consistency. It creates short-term spikes of effort followed by long periods of collapse. Discipline does not work in spikes. It works in loops. A loop begins with a simple action, something small enough to repeat without resistance, something that does not require negotiation with yourself. And then that action is repeated again and again, not because it feels powerful in the moment, but because it is stable enough to be repeated tomorrow. This is where small consistency becomes powerful. A single disciplined action does not change your identity, but repeated disciplined actions begin to shape how your mind sees itself. Each repetition sends a signal. This is normal behavior. This is who we are. This is how we operate. And over time, these signals accumulate into something far stronger than motivation. Momentum. Momentum is not speed. It is continuity. It is the reduction of friction between intention and action. And once momentum begins to form, discipline becomes easier, not harder, because the system starts supporting itself. This is where most people underestimate the process. They assume discipline must feel difficult to be meaningful. But the truth is the opposite. If discipline is always difficult, it is not yet structured correctly. Real discipline reduces internal resistance over time. It becomes smoother through repetition, not heavier. And this is where the loop begins to close. Action reinforces identity. Every time you act in a disciplined way, you are not just completing a task. You are reinforcing a belief about who you are. You are sending a signal to your mind. I am someone who does this. And the brain, always searching for patterns of consistency, begins to accept that signal as truth. But the loop does not stop there, because identity reinforces action. Once the identity begins to form, it starts influencing future behavior automatically. You no longer need to convince yourself to act in the same way. The action feels more aligned, more expected, less negotiable, and what once required effort begins to feel like the default response. This is how discipline becomes self-sustaining. It is not a command you give yourself every day. It is a loop that continues operating in the background of your behavior. Action shapes identity. Identity shapes future action. And each cycle strengthens the next. Over time, this loop becomes so stable that resistance loses influence. You no longer debate whether to start. You no longer spend energy deciding if you should continue. The behavior becomes embedded in your structure of self-perception. And when identity and action are aligned, consistency stops being fragile. This is why some people appear effortlessly disciplined. It is not because they feel more motivated. It is because their loop is stronger. Their repetition has lasted long enough to eliminate internal negotiation. Their identity and behavior are no longer separate. They are the same system operating continuously. And once that system is in place, discipline no longer feels like a struggle. It feels like alignment. But this loop only forms under one condition: repetition over time. Not perfect repetition, not intense repetition, just consistent repetition, even when the result feels small or insignificant in the moment. Because discipline does not measure progress in days, it measures it in cycles. Each cycle strengthens the next. Each repetition reduces resistance. Each action makes the following action slightly easier. And although the change is almost invisible at first, it compounds quietly in the background until it becomes undeniable. This is the discipline loop. Not a moment of transformation, but a process of reinforcement that gradually reshapes who you are through what you repeatedly do. Chapter 12. The Productivity Environment Design. At a certain point in productivity, you stop asking, "How do I become more disciplined?" and start asking a far more important question: what is my environment doing to me? Because by this stage, you begin to realize something uncomfortable but undeniable. Your behavior is not as independent as you once believed. It is not purely driven by intention. It is shaped, influenced, and often silently dictated by the space you exist in. Most people assume discipline is an internal battle. But in reality, discipline is often an environmental outcome. Your surroundings are constantly giving you instructions without words. Where you sit, what is within reach, what is visible in your peripheral vision, what is one click away, what is already open on your screen. All of these elements are shaping your next decision before you consciously make it. And the most powerful part is this: you usually do not notice it happening. This is why environment silently dictates behavior more than intention. You can intend to focus, but if your environment is filled with frictionless distractions, intention loses almost every time. You can intend to work deeply, but if your phone is beside you, unlocked and within reach, your attention will eventually drift. Not because you lack discipline, but because access reduces resistance, and reduced resistance always wins over intention in the long run. This is the hidden design of modern life. Everything is engineered for convenience, speed, and instant access. And while that sounds beneficial on the surface, it creates an invisible problem. The easier it is to escape focus, the harder it becomes to maintain it. Frictionless distractions destroy focus, not because they are powerful, but because they are effortless. They require no decision-making, no commitment, no transition, just a small impulse, and you are out of deep work and into stimulation. And every time that happens, your focus resets. Not completely, but enough to prevent continuity from forming. And without continuity, deep work becomes rare, fragmented, and unstable. This is why some environments make productivity feel natural, while others make it feel like a constant struggle. Because physical space is not neutral, it is active. It either supports focus or it competes with it. A cluttered desk does not just represent mess, it creates cognitive noise. An environment filled with open tabs, visible distractions, or multi-purpose zones sends mixed signals to the brain. You are not just sitting in a space. You are interacting with a system of cues that constantly suggest alternative behaviors, and your brain responds, not through logic, but through conditioning. If your environment is associated with distraction, your mind will drift more easily when you enter it. If your environment is associated with focus, your mind will begin to shift into work mode automatically. Over time, these associations become deeply embedded. You do not consciously decide how to behave, you respond to context. This is where design becomes more powerful than willpower. Willpower requires effort in the moment. Design removes the need for effort entirely. Willpower says, resist distraction. Design says, distraction is not available here. Willpower asks you to fight your environment. Design reshapes the environment so that the fight is no longer necessary. And this shift changes everything about long-term execution. Because no matter how strong your motivation is, it will always fluctuate. No matter how disciplined you feel today, that feeling will not remain constant. But your environment can remain stable. And stability is what creates consistency when internal states change. This is why high performers obsess over structure more than effort. They are not relying on stronger self-control. They are reducing the number of moments where self-control is required. They engineer their surroundings so that the default behavior aligns with their goals. And once the default is correct, productivity becomes less about force and more about flow. Think about how behavior changes based on space. A bedroom feels different from a workspace. A phone-free environment feels different from a notification-filled one. A clean, minimal setup feels different from a cluttered one. These differences are not just aesthetic. They are psychological triggers that shift mental states before any conscious thought occurs. The mind adapts quickly to context, and this adaptability is the key to environmental design. If you repeatedly use a space for deep work, that space begins to carry the expectation of focus. When you enter it, your brain recognizes the pattern and begins to prepare accordingly. Similarly, if a space is repeatedly used for distraction, it begins to trigger distraction automatically, even before you engage with anything specific. This is how environment becomes habit reinforcement, and once habits are tied to space, behavior becomes more stable than ever before. You no longer rely on motivation to start. You rely on context. You no longer fight distraction in real time. You prevent it before it begins. You no longer attempt to force focus into unstable environments. You create environments where focus becomes the most natural outcome. This is the real difference between struggling with productivity and living inside it. One requires constant internal negotiation. The other is structurally aligned. And once you understand this, your perspective shifts. You begin to see your surroundings differently. You notice friction points that were previously invisible. You recognize how small environmental adjustments can lead to large behavioral changes. You stop asking how to push harder and start asking how to design better, because in the long run, design always outperforms willpower. Not because willpower is weak, but because it was never meant to carry the full weight of your environment. And when your environment starts working with you instead of against you, productivity stops being something you struggle to maintain and becomes something your surroundings quietly support every day. Chapter 13. The Momentum Effect. Momentum is one of the most misunderstood forces in productivity. People often assume success comes from large, decisive actions, big breakthroughs, intense focus sessions, or dramatic bursts of motivation. But in reality, most sustained productivity is not built from intensity. It is built from movement. Once movement begins, something subtle takes over, and that something changes everything about how effort feels, because starting is the hardest part of almost any task. Not because the task itself is difficult, but because the mind resists transition. It prefers stability over initiation. It prefers continuation over change. So before anything meaningful begins, there is friction, a quiet resistance that says not now, later or after something else. This is where most productivity fails, not in execution, but in initiation. Momentum solves this problem, not by eliminating resistance, but by reducing its influence after the first action is completed. Because once movement starts, the mind shifts state. What felt heavy in stillness begins to feel lighter in motion. The psychological barrier weakens, not because the task changed, but because the state of doing has already been activated. This is the momentum effect. Small wins trigger larger behavioral cascades. A small win is not insignificant. It is a signal to the brain that action is possible, that progress is occurring, that effort is producing results, and once the brain receives that signal, it begins to adjust its expectations. Instead of preparing for resistance, it begins preparing for continuation. And continuation is where productivity begins to compound. At the start of a task, everything feels separated. Each action requires conscious effort. Each step feels isolated. But once momentum is established, actions begin to connect. One task leads into another without the same level of resistance. What once required force begins to feel like flow. This is why productivity often feels exponential rather than linear when momentum is active. You do not simply complete one task and stop. You complete one task and something inside you shifts slightly. The barrier to starting the next task is lower. The mental friction is reduced. The hesitation is shorter. And suddenly, what would have been difficult to start on its own becomes easier simply because movement is already happening. Progress creates psychological acceleration. This acceleration is not visible from the outside, but it is deeply felt internally. There is a shift in identity during momentum. You stop thinking of yourself as someone trying to get things done and begin acting as someone already in motion. That subtle shift reduces internal debate. It reduces overthinking. It reduces delay. And once delay decreases, output increases naturally. Most people underestimate how much resistance exists at the starting point of tasks. They assume productivity problems are about execution, when in reality, they are about activation. Getting into motion is often more difficult than staying in motion. And once motion is sustained, the mind stops negotiating with itself and starts cooperating with the process. This is why momentum reduces resistance to starting tasks. After completing something small, the brain registers a pattern. Action is already happening, so the threshold for beginning the next action is lower. The identity shifts slightly from "I need to start working" to "I am already working," and that shift eliminates a surprising amount of friction. At that point, productivity no longer depends on force. It depends on continuation, and continuation is self-reinforcing. This is where productivity begins to compound like interest. Just as financial interest grows not from a single input, but from repeated accumulation over time, productivity grows from repeated cycles of action that build on each other. Each completed task does not just add output, it increases the likelihood of additional output. This compounding effect is what separates inconsistent effort from sustained progress. Because without momentum, every task is an isolated struggle. You start, stop, restart, and lose energy in transitions. But with momentum, tasks begin to connect. The space between them shrinks. The mental cost of starting decreases, and the overall system becomes more efficient without requiring additional willpower. This is why some days feel extremely productive while others feel stuck. It is not always about ability or energy. It is often about whether momentum was successfully established early in the sequence of work. A small win at the beginning of the day can set the tone for everything that follows. A delay or distraction at the start can collapse the entire flow. This is also why the first action of the day carries disproportionate weight. It is not about what you do first. It is about whether you enter motion at all. Even a small task can unlock a chain reaction. Responding to an email, organizing a space, completing a simple task. These actions are not trivial when viewed through the lens of momentum. They are ignition points. Once ignition happens, resistance weakens, and as resistance weakens, output increases without additional force. You begin to notice that tasks that once felt heavy now feel sequential. One leads into another. Decisions become faster, transitions become smoother, and effort becomes less about pushing and more about continuing what is already in motion. This is the true nature of productivity at scale, not isolated bursts of effort, but continuous movement sustained by psychological acceleration. And once you understand momentum, you stop waiting for perfect conditions to begin. You start small, knowing that small movement is enough to trigger larger movement. You no longer try to force entire systems into motion at once. You simply begin, because beginning is what activates everything that follows. And from that point forward, productivity is no longer something you start. It is something you maintain. Chapter 14. The Morning Execution Code. The morning is not just the beginning of your day. It is the foundation that silently determines how the rest of your hours will behave. Most people underestimate this completely. They treat the morning as a soft entry point into life, something flexible, unstructured, and reactive. They wake up, reach for their phone, absorb information they did not choose consciously, and only then begin to think about what matters. By that point, the direction of the day has already been influenced, not by intention, but by exposure, because the first inputs of the day are never neutral. They shape attention, mood, and mental clarity far more than people realize. What you consume first becomes the lens through which everything else is processed. And once that lens is fragmented, the entire day inherits that fragmentation. This is why morning structure sets the tone for everything that follows. The brain after sleep is in its most impressionable state. It has not yet been overloaded with competing inputs. It has not yet been pulled in multiple directions. It is still forming its cognitive rhythm for the day. And whatever enters first becomes the baseline for that rhythm. If the first experience is distraction, the day begins in fragmentation. If the first experience is focus, the day begins in alignment. This is the core of the morning execution code. It is not about doing more in the morning. It is about protecting the sequence in which your mind is activated. Because early decisions determine cognitive performance later in ways most people never consciously connect. Every small choice in the morning has a compounding effect. The decision to check your phone immediately does not just consume time, it activates a reactive mindset. It shifts attention outward before it has been stabilized inward. It introduces external noise before internal clarity has been established. And once that happens, the rest of the day has to compete with that initial fragmentation. But when the morning begins with controlled execution, something different happens. You set the direction before the world sets it for you. This is why execution should begin before distractions enter. Not after you feel ready, not after you check messages, not after you warm up with input, but before external systems have a chance to take over your attention. Because once distractions enter, they rarely leave quietly, they multiply. One notification leads to another. One quick check turns into multiple shifts in attention. And what started as a small interruption becomes a pattern of fragmentation that continues long after the initial moment. This is how mornings silently collapse productivity. Not through one major failure, but through a chain of small reactive decisions that reshape the entire cognitive structure of the day. The alternative is deliberate structure. Rituals reduce decision fatigue by removing negotiation from the morning entirely. When your morning has a predefined sequence, your mind does not need to decide what comes next. It simply follows the structure that already exists. This preserves mental energy for actual execution, rather than early-stage decision-making. Decision fatigue is not always visible, but it is always costly. Every decision you make in the morning reduces the energy available for deeper work later. And the more fragmented those early decisions are, the more scattered your attention becomes as the day progresses. That is why high performers often appear calm in the morning, not because they are doing less, but because they are doing less thinking about what to do next. They are executing a code, not improvising a sequence. And this code is simple in structure, but powerful in effect. It begins with removing immediate access to distraction. Before the mind is exposed to external input, it is guided into internal alignment. A controlled action is performed first, not because it is urgent, but because it defines direction. This initial execution creates a psychological anchor that stabilizes attention for the rest of the day. Once this anchor is set, everything else becomes easier. Tasks no longer compete for attention in the same chaotic way. Focus has already been established in a protected state. The mind has already experienced depth before noise enters. And because of that, even when interruptions appear later, they do not fully destabilize the system. The difference is not the absence of distraction. It is the order in which focus is built. Most people allow the world to enter their mind before they enter their work. But the morning execution code reverses this sequence. It ensures that action comes first, input comes later, execution comes before consumption, direction comes before reaction, and that simple reversal changes everything. Because once you begin your day in execution mode, your identity shifts into alignment with action. You are no longer reacting to the day, you are shaping it, and that shift carries forward into every hour that follows. Even when the day becomes unpredictable, the foundation remains stable, because it was built before the noise began. Chapter 15. The New Identity, Becoming the Productive Self. There is a point in the productivity journey where everything you once struggled with begins to feel different, not easier in a superficial sense, not magically effortless, but quieter, more natural, less negotiated. And that change does not come from another technique, another system, or another burst of motivation. It comes from identity, finally locking in. Because everything you have learned up to this point, focus, discipline, energy, habits, environment, momentum, is not meant to function as separate tools forever. They are temporary supports, structural scaffolding, training mechanisms that guide you toward a deeper shift that most people never fully recognize. That shift is becoming the kind of person who no longer has to try. At the beginning of change, everything requires effort. You remind yourself to focus. You push yourself to start. You negotiate with distractions. You fight resistance constantly. Productivity feels like a sequence of internal battles where every action must be won before it is taken. But over time, something subtle begins to happen. The effort begins to decrease, not because the work becomes lighter, but because the identity behind the work begins to solidify. This is the moment when productivity stops being a practice and starts becoming a state of being. Because identity is not what you occasionally do. Identity is what you default to when there is no external pressure forcing you to act differently. It is the automatic response your mind chooses when multiple options are available. And once that internal default changes, behavior follows without friction. This is why productivity becomes automatic when identity is locked in. You no longer wake up and ask, "How do I stay disciplined today?" That question disappears. It is replaced by something quieter, more stable, more integrated, the simple continuation of who you already are. And that is the transformation most people misunderstand. They believe change is about pushing harder, but real change is about becoming someone who no longer needs to push at all in the same way. The effort does not vanish, it shifts location. It moves from constant internal resistance to simple execution alignment. At this stage, you stop operating from motivation. Motivation becomes irrelevant because it is no longer the source of action. You are no longer waiting for energy to appear before you begin. You are no longer waiting for clarity before you engage. You simply operate from identity, and action follows naturally from that identity. "I am productive" is no longer a statement you repeat. It becomes a behavioral reality. And once that happens, something fundamental changes in how you experience time and effort. You stop trying to be productive. Trying implies resistance. Trying implies uncertainty. Trying implies that there is still a gap between who you are and what you are doing. But when identity stabilizes, that gap closes. Action becomes consistent with self-perception, and internal negotiation disappears. This is where consistency replaces effort-based struggle. Consistency is often misunderstood as repetition alone. But real consistency is not about doing the same thing every day through force. It is about reducing variance in behavior, because identity no longer fluctuates with emotion or circumstance. When identity is unstable, behavior is inconsistent. When identity is stable, behavior becomes predictable, and predictability is the foundation of long-term productivity. Because once your actions are predictable in alignment with your identity, you no longer need to restart your discipline every day. You are not rebuilding focus from zero. You are not re-entering structure from chaos. You are continuing a system that already exists. This is why transformation becomes permanent when identity shifts, not because external conditions stop changing, but because internal reference points become fixed. You no longer evaluate every decision from scratch. You evaluate it from identity alignment. Does this action match who I am becoming? If yes, it continues. If no, it feels misaligned. And that evaluation becomes automatic. Over time, even resistance loses influence. There are still moments of distraction, still moments of fatigue, still moments where the easier path appears more attractive. But instead of triggering a full behavioral collapse, these moments become brief fluctuations within a stable system. You do not spiral, you correct, because identity acts as an anchor, and once anchored, behavior stabilizes around it. This is why the productive self is not built through intensity, but through repetition, aligned with self-definition. Every focused action reinforces identity. Every completed task strengthens internal consistency. Every moment of discipline becomes another confirmation of who you are. And eventually, those confirmations accumulate into something irreversible. You stop seeing productivity as something you do. You begin seeing it as something you are. And that shift removes the need for constant self-control, because control is no longer external. It is embedded in identity itself. The decision-making process becomes shorter. The resistance becomes weaker. The starting point becomes automatic. Even on low-energy days, the structure holds. Even in distraction-heavy environments, the identity remains stable. Even when motivation disappears, behavior stays aligned. This is the final stage of the productivity shift. Not a perfect system, not a flawless routine, not a life without challenges, but a stable identity that naturally produces consistent action without internal fragmentation. And once you reach this point, productivity is no longer something you chase, rebuild, or fight for. Everything you have explored in this journey was never just about productivity. It was never about doing more tasks, managing tighter schedules, or forcing yourself into discipline through pressure. It was always something deeper, something structural, something internal, something invisible, because productivity is not a skill you learn once and keep forever. It is a system you embody. And the moment you stop treating it as a set of techniques and start recognizing it as an operating system for how you think, focus, and act, everything begins to reorganize itself around that understanding. Attention becomes the center of everything, not time, not effort, not even motivation, attention. Because when attention is scattered, nothing holds. When attention is weak, everything fragments. But when attention is protected, directed, and stabilized, even ordinary effort becomes powerful. Even simple actions begin to compound. Even small decisions begin to shape long-term outcomes. This is why everything changes when attention becomes your most protected asset. You stop giving it away cheaply. You stop letting it leak through constant interruption. You stop allowing every external signal to decide your internal direction. And slowly, almost quietly, your life begins to reorganize around what you choose to focus on instead of what tries to capture you. And this is where the real transformation happens. Not in loud breakthroughs, not in dramatic shifts, but in invisible changes that accumulate until your entire way of operating is different. You become less reactive, more intentional, less fragmented, more stable, less scattered, more directed. And over time, even your sense of effort changes, because what once felt like discipline begins to feel like identity. What once required force begins to feel natural. What once demanded constant correction begins to run automatically in the background of your behavior. This is the point where you are no longer trying to be productive. You are no longer forcing focus, no longer chasing consistency, no longer rebuilding motivation every day. You are the system itself. And once that shift happens, productivity is no longer something you return to. It is something you live through, moment by moment, as a quiet and permanent part of how you operate in the world.